we'll get started. I guess a lot of people aren't here today just because of a lot of classes are canceled this week. But so for anyone listening on the webcast at a later point, just a reminder that if you're not in class, you can just watch the recording and then submit a one paragraph thing about something you found interesting from today's class. So no worries if you're not here. Okay, so yeah, today our focus will be talking about armed neutrality and what makes Switzerland's military very sort of unique in a way. And in doing this, we're going to be picking up a lot of where we left off on the history lecture from lecture number 2. If you remember, we kind of went up to the end of the 19th century and then left it at there. So we're going to be going a bit into the 20th century now, specifically a lot on World War I, but especially on World War II. So let's begin. As usual, like I mentioned at the beginning of the class, I'll be using a lot of videos throughout the class, and so this lecture especially. So we'll start with this one. Oh. Okay, give me a second. Sound on this thing's always weird. All right, hold on. That's fine.
Surrounded by... This is a real-life lore video made possible by Hover. Get 10% off your custom domain or email from Hover at hover.com/reallifelore. Switzerland is a tiny landlocked country surrounded by France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. If you've ever looked at a map of the European Union, you'll notice an awkward blob in the middle which doesn't belong to it, and that blob is Switzerland. Switzerland is famously neutral, and in addition to not being a part of the EU, it's also not a member of NATO, and it didn't even join the United Nations until pretty recently in 2002. In fact, Switzerland is so neutral that it hasn't fought a single war in over 200 years, the last one being against Napoleon in 1815. All of this is despite the fact that Switzerland is in the middle of Europe and surrounded by historically more aggressive countries. So why is it that Switzerland has been such a stable and safe place for centuries? The answer lies in understanding the geography of Switzerland. The country can really be divided into 3 separate parts. In the south are the Swiss Alps, a gigantic mountain range that covers most of Switzerland's territory and separates it from Italy and Austria. To the west and north are the Jura Mountains, a range much smaller than the Alps, but still large enough to separate the country from France. And finally, there is the Swiss Plateau, a basin dotted by rolling hills, rivers, and lakes that is home to most of Switzerland's population. It's no accident that Switzerland's major cities are all located in this region instead of the other 2. But it's not as easy of a defensible position either. Switzerland has long been a little paranoid about a foreign invasion, and it's not without good reason. In the First World War, Germany invaded neutral Belgium in order to attack France in a more vulnerable position. And in the Second World War, Switzerland found herself in 1940 to be completely surrounded by Axis-occupied territory and faced an imminent threat of invasion from Nazi Germany. The invasion never happened, but fears persisted into the Cold War of a potential Soviet invasion, and that attitude has never fully gone away. Switzerland's plan for dealing with a potential invasion from anybody was called the National Redoubt, and it was essentially intended to make any possible enemy look at the map, look at Switzerland, and think to themselves, no thanks, I'll take over something a little easier instead. The first reason why is Switzerland continues to have mandatory male conscription. meaning that all men have to serve in the military for 170 days and receive basic training. They enter into the reserves afterwards and keep their rifles at their home, and although many get exemptions, Switzerland has the ability to mobilize over 200,000 soldiers within 72 hours of an emergency being declared. In addition, every road, bridge, tunnel, and railroad in the country has been designed in a way that they can be remotely blown up to deny a possible invader from ever using them. There are over 3,000 of these points that can be blown up inside of the country, including entire mountainsides that can be detonated to cause a landslide to block off entire roads. In addition to all of this, the modern Swiss military strategy has always been to abandon the plateau and the city centers and retreat almost the entire military into the Alpine region. Here, high in the mountains, the Swiss have built over 26,000 bunkers and fortified positions ranging from anti-tank guns, anti-air guns, or machine gun nests. They are camouflaged like this anti-tank gun that looks like a rock, or this barn that's actually a machine gun nest on the left, and an anti-tank gun on the right. And both of these are connected by a tunnel underground. There are camouflage positions like these all over the Alpine region of Switzerland, which means that the entire country is basically one big booby trap, an impregnable castle in the center of Europe. This is why Switzerland has been able to remain neutral throughout some of the most difficult times in European history. But many now question the importance of this defensive and neutral mindset. Germany, Austria, Italy, and France are today all European Union member states and have no militaristic intentions on conquering Switzerland. The National Redoubt has seen many of its fortresses and bunkers turned into museums in the last few years, and Switzerland is planning on downsizing its military from around 200,000 to only 80,000 by the year 2020. But nonetheless, one place that Switzerland will always be is the safest place in the world to possibly be at in the event of a global nuclear war. This is because Switzerland is the only country in the world to have enough nuclear fallout shelters to house their entire population. In fact, Switzerland has enough fallout shelters to house 114% of their population, meaning that even in the event of a large refugee influx, the country would still have enough shelters to fit everybody inside of them. All residential buildings inside of the country built after 1978 are mandated by law to contain a nuclear shelter capable of surviving a 12 megaton blast from a distance of 700 meters away. As of 2006, there are over 8.6 million fallout shelters located throughout the country, ranging in sizes like this in a normal house, up to gigantic public shelters built inside of tunnels that can house over 2,000 people for over 4 months. In the event of a nuclear attack on Switzerland, it is possible that the entire population of the country could retreat to their bunkers and continue fighting off any invader after the bombs have exploded. Not even nuclear weapons can conquer the fortress of Switzerland. And it has been said before that in the event of a global nuclear war, the only survivors would be the heads of state of a few countries, cockroaches, and 8.4 million Swiss citizens. If a nuclear war ever does happen, then the Swiss have enough bunkers for not only them, but a few friends to survive it all through with. So remember this when it may become important later. Switzerland is likely the safest place you could possibly be during the event of a nuclear war or World War III. Before you start making plans to visit, though, it would be nice to let other people know.
Okay. So yeah, that video was good, like introduction to basically most of the topics that we'll be going through in today's lecture. So the reason I put that video first was I really wanted to focus on, that's the only one that like really stressed the geography part. But the geography of Switzerland is so important, and that's like kind of what allows their entire system to work. And it's hard to see the national borders here, but yeah, basically the important thing to remember is that this entire region is the Alps, and then this region up here is all the Jura Mountains, and basically all the major cities, Geneva, the Seine, Bern, Zurich, Zug, they're all in this like one center plateau. And because of that, an invasion from the south is pretty much close to impossible. Invasion from the north is a little bit easier, but still pretty much undoable. So they really have to defend like this border and this border. So going back to the history thing, let's look at a little bit about what went on during World War I. This is from a great channel.
I'm Indy Nidell. This is The Great War. And this is our third episode of Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in the chair of wisdom and answer your questions about World War I. H1 Munculus, or Homunculus, writes, once the trenches reached the coast and neither side could outflank the other, why did no one try to move through Switzerland to outflank their opposition? Sure, Switzerland was neutral, but so was Belgium at the start of the war, and that didn't stop Germany. Well, Switzerland was pretty well prepared by attacks for most people, as you can imagine, especially after watching the first couple months of the war unfold, and violating Swiss neutrality by either side would have instantly given one of the, by this point, evenly matched opposing sides a new and fresh enemy to face, which neither had the strength for at this point. And have you seen Switzerland? The Germans, for example, would have had to cross the Upper Rhine and then the Jura Mountains to even get into France, and then they would be close to nothing that was vital to French interests anyhow. Hugh Ryan asks...
All right, yeah, that's pretty much it. Basically, like, the main reason that no one really bothered to invade Switzerland during World War I was that both sides were pretty even at this point. England hadn't joined the war officially yet, and basically the idea was that no one... by invading through Switzerland, you're just going to create a new enemy for either side that does the invasion, and that would just like offset the balance of power. And so neither side wanted to go ahead and try to do that. And even if they did, it wouldn't have been that easy or helpful. Yeah. By the way, this channel is really cool. It's called The Great War, and what they've been doing is every for the past like few years, they do a video following the 100th centennial of like major World War I events. So whenever there's like a major battle, like they'll do a video on that. So it's cool. They've been running it since like 2014, and it's going to end in like 2018, I guess. So a little bit about the interwar history. One kind of interesting thing about World War I, Switzerland during World War I, that often isn't that well known is that Vladimir Lenin was actually in political exile in Switzerland during most of World War I. He was sort of he was in Finland for a long time, and then the Russians sort of kicked him out of Finland, and so he fled to Switzerland, and he spent a lot of time in Bern and then Zurich trying to sort of incite a socialist revolution within Switzerland. And there were a lot of people who supported him, but in the end, he was essentially deemed too radical by most of these socialist parties within Switzerland, and they kind of like, disavowed him. But there was this big like conference in this town called Zimmerwald, and that was like, it's often heralded as like the birthplace of the communist revolution. And like throughout like the Soviet era during the Cold War, like the town of Zimmerwald would always get like postcards and stuff from people asking like, oh, we want to know more about Lenin's time here and stuff. And Zimmerwald kind of basically just ignored it until like a few years ago, where they finally like, put up like one little plaque where the conference happened and stuff. And then this is like what is it? It's a sculpture on the tower of Geneva Church, which it says Geneva is the city of refugees, but it kind of memorializes Lenin's exile in Switzerland, which is kind of a weird thing to do. I don't know, but yeah. So in the interwar period, Switzerland joined the League of Nations in 1920, and the League of Nations was actually even headquartered in Geneva. But they specifically, when they joined, they made sure that they had a clause where they would not have any military obligation to the League. And during this time, there was a lot of threats internally from both fascism and communism, and they kind of like tried to suppress both of them, but they saw fascism as the bigger threat. And so that was kind of their main worry at the time. At the time, also, the government, Swiss government, really tried to push a lot of Swiss nationalism because they saw a lot of nationalism happening in the countries around it. And the reason that they pushed it wasn't so much to to try to mimic the other countries, but more because they saw that German nationalism was working in a way where they were trying to unite everyone who was ethnically German, and since a lot of the Swiss are ethnically German, they wanted to make sure that like they wanted to avoid any cantons like trying to like buy into the German nationalism or the Italian nationalism. So that's why they really pushed a sort of Swiss nationalism kind of thing. They ended up leaving the League of Nations in the 30s because the League of Nations was kind of basically saying to like put sanctions on Germany, and Switzerland basically says like, no, we don't want to put sanctions. We kind of support as much like free trade as possible, and so for that reason, they ended up leaving the League of Nations. So preparing for war is they got a lot of good assurances from Germany. Like so now, this is when Hitler's in power, and they got a lot of assurances from Germany that they wouldn't be invaded, but they were still very skeptical. They were like skeptical from like 1937, and they predicted that the war would start in a war would break out in 1939, and they happened to be pretty accurate about that. They had some initial plans to collaborate with the French, but they ended up never doing that. But when Germany ended up taking over France, like they found out about these like secret talks and stuff, and that kind of like soured a lot of Germany's relationships with Switzerland at the time. And then so this one guy, this officer, Henry Gassan, he kind of got put in charge of the defensive effort of Switzerland. And he basically met with a bunch of Swiss senior officers in this meadow. This is the Rudley Meadow, if you guys remember, was where the initial pact creating the Swiss Confederation was done with those three guys putting up their hands and stuff. So like they did it very specifically as a ceremonial thing to do it in the same spot. And you laid out the redoubt strategy, which is their strategy to prevent invasion, which I will go into in a little bit. And so basically the idea was that they couldn't match the fighting force just by pure numbers, so they were going to use geography to their advantage. A bit about the redoubt plan, how it worked was, the plan was they were going to, it's kind of very like radical of a plan, but the idea was they knew that they were never going to win against the Germans. And so the plan was just to abandon the entire Swiss plateau, abandon all the major cities, let the Germans take them over, and basically regress into the Alps. And basically from there, they will just continue fighting in like guerrilla warfare and like have a war of attrition until the Germans finally leave. And they like planned for their entire population to like move into these bunkers into the mountains. And basically they also like no one was given the authority to surrender, like not even the federal president, and everyone was told that any surrender broadcast is probably an enemy lie, and you should just resist to the end. So the idea was like, never surrender. They're gonna fight till the end. Put on this video a little bit about what Switzerland did during World War II.
Why didn't Hitler attack Switzerland? There are numerous reasons for this. First of all, after Operation Fallgelb, Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe suffered some losses fighting the Allies and had to replenish lost equipment before conducting any major operation. Also, the Luftwaffe was fighting over England for air domination to make Operation Sea Lion possible and to prevent the RAF from carrying out their own air raids on Germany. So even if most of the land forces could have been redirected to the Swiss front, they would probably lack proper air support, which was vital to Germany's previous successes. Second of all, Italian forces who were to support Germany during the invasion were already engaged with the Allied forces in Africa and Greek forces in Albania. They were losing on both fronts, so it was impossible for them to open a new, effective one. Italian army and air force were also using, in many cases, outdated and ineffective equipment, and most of their divisions were unfit for combat. So even if they were to attack Switzerland, even with Germany's help, they probably wouldn't even be able to penetrate their outer defenses. Third of all, mountainous terrain is an easy one to defend, so even outnumbered, and in some cases outclassed, the Swiss army wouldn't have many troubles holding onto their ground. Additionally, they had at their disposal many bunkers and defense systems, which were gradually expanded since the outbreak of the Great War. Swiss plan, in an event of German attack, was to use scorched earth policy, just like the Soviets did, but on a larger scale. Every tunnel, road, and passage were to be destroyed. Every sign with a town or street name would be removed, and locals would even be forbidden to sell maps. This would be a logistical nightmare for the Germans, who wouldn't be able to use the tanks and armored vehicles effectively, and would have troubles transporting supplies. Swiss society was very anti-Nazi, so any large-scale collaboration wouldn't exist. With hit-and-run tactics, good defensive terrain, and inability for Germans to use the Blitzkrieg doctrine to its full extent, Swiss could have inflicted very high losses on the Germans and Italians, or even prolonged the war enough for Soviets to inevitably surprise attack Reich, thus forcing them into making peace or truce with them. Fourth of all, Germany stored much of its gold in Swiss banks, so instantaneously after the declaration of war nearly $400 million in gold would be lost and taken over by Switzerland. Even if Germans would be able to annex Switzerland, they wouldn't recover their gold, because Swedes would make sure to hide somewhere where Germans wouldn't find it. In conclusion, Hitler's attack on Switzerland would be just another nail to the coffin of the German Reich. It was just a suicide for Germany to open a new, unnecessary front while others were unstable and uncertain, losing a lot of equipment and manpower before the planned Operation Barbarossa and necessary Operation Marita also wouldn't help their overall situation. It just wasn't worth it.
Yeah. Especially the gold stuff. We'll go a lot more into that in a future lecture, focusing on the Swiss banking industry. There's a lot of, it's one of the most like touchy subjects in like a lot of history. Yeah. So Hitler actually did have a plan to invade Switzerland. He absolutely like hated the Swiss. He saw their entire state as an anachronism, and I'll read a quote that he said, obviously translated to English, but Switzerland possessed the most disgusting and miserable people and political system. The Swiss were the mortal enemies of the new Germany. So I mean that's pretty like, whoa, like Nazi Germany is basically claiming the Swiss to be their mortal enemies. And so basically, as soon as like the invasion of France was over, the very next day, they basically started to plan an invasion of Switzerland. It was called Operation Tannenbaum. And basically Hitler was like wanted to personally oversee the entire thing. Like he had this like weird personal interest in this. And and the plan was having 11 German divisions and 15 Italians divisions, which is about 300,000 German soldiers and 500,000 Italian to basically swarm Switzerland from all sides. But basically what happened was, you know, the Germans were very busy with like other fronts, and they basically kept delaying Operation Tannenbaum until after D-Day. They basically got rid of the plan altogether. So a little bit about what Switzerland actually did during the war was, so the issue is that Switzerland was surrounded on all sides by German allies. They were surrounded by Nazi Germany, Austria, Fascist France, Italy, and then Vichy France. So they were kind of very limited in what they were able to do, and the Germans kind of forced them to trade only with them. And the Swiss tried their best to send resources to the Allies as well, especially a lot of metals and such to the British. But it was very difficult for them, and that kind of put a lot of strain. But a lot of in modern today, like a lot of people claim that Switzerland was like, you know, working only with Germany, but it was kind of a little bit out of necessity. A common like Swiss adage from the time was 6 days a week we work for the Germans. On the 7th day we pray for the Allies. So ideologically they were much more close to the Allies, but just because of their circumstance they couldn't really do anything about it. A lot of the Germans used the Swiss franc for trading because most allied or neutral countries would not accept the German currency, so they ended up using the franc. And on multiple times, Swiss airspace was violated, 6,501 times, according to Swiss military records. And basically what the Swiss started to do in order to stop this from happening was, especially at night, they'd order like everyone to black out the city, turn off all their lights, So back then, during World War II, without like sophisticated navigation equipment, you often depended on where like the position of cities from where you could see them in the air to locate where you are on a map. And so by doing these blackouts, they made it very hard for both sides to try to like navigate their planes at night over Swiss territory. This kind of ended up backfiring on them a little bit because on April 1st, 1944, the Americans accidentally bombed a city called Schaffhausen when they were in fact trying to attack a German city called Tuttlingen, about 21 miles away, and they dropped like 400 bombs on this Swiss city, and it was like a big disaster and stuff. The U.S. ended up paying $62 million in compensation. And now that's not to say that the Swiss, just let the other people fly over their territory. They did fight back a little bit. They had their Air Force at the time had 300 pilots and 210 planes. Throughout the time, they shot down 11 Luftwaffe planes and forced down more than 100 Allied planes. By forced down, it means either shooting them down, or the Allies were usually much more open to landing when told to, unlike the Germans. So one thing is the one major battle that the Swiss were officially neutral during World War II, but they actually did have technically one battle where basically the Swiss detected 3 German bombers and shot them down. And then basically Göring commanded all planes that are going through Switzerland to have fighter escorts. And so they sent another 38 fighters through, and the Swiss basically combated them with 14 of their own planes. And weirdly, the Swiss actually ended up, I guess you'd call it a win in this battle, because 4 of the German planes went down and only 1 Swiss plane went down. Technically, that's the only physical, almost offensive altercation that the Swiss had throughout all of World War II. And then another thing is that a lot of the Allied planes that were forced down, they actually took a lot of prisoners of war, including American prisoners of war. And basically, most of the prisoners of war were kept in nice alpine ski resorts, pretty luxurious. But there were a few that were kept in camps, which were in pretty bad conditions, even run by one of them was run by a Nazi sympathizer. So there are some in the American military who do hold some resentment about that. And so throughout World War II, the Swiss tried their best to take in as many refugees as possible. It's another common citation against them is that they were sort of they turned away a lot of people, but the reason that the Swiss government gives for that is just because of resources. In fact, Switzerland took in the most refugees in ratio to their own citizen population. So just because it has a small population, it wasn't able to take in the same amount of refugees that countries like Portugal did. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and put this video. Probably not finish the entire thing.
World War II began when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The Polish army was defeated after just over a month of fighting. But the Poles continued to help their French allies, notably in battles following the German invasion of France. When France was defeated by the Nazis in 1940, 35,000 Polish troops were evacuated, 12,000 of them to Switzerland. They were interned in military camps throughout the country and were not allowed to forge relationships with Swiss women. As many Swiss men had been called up, the Poles were valued labourers, building streets and farming. "400 of them were allowed to pursue academic studies. When the war ended, most of the internees had to leave Switzerland, but 2,000 remained. Their story is told in pictures on display at the Polish Museum in Rapperswil, where a reunion of ex-Polish internees and their offspring rekindled many memories. Józef Parodowski was 25 when he arrived in Switzerland. He married a Swiss woman after the war, and they had 3 children. Josef died in an accident in the 50s. His daughter, Nita Eschliman-Pradowski, is now trying to find out more about his life.
Mit allen, wo wir reden, very few of the people we talk to about these times really know anything, because
In interest of time, I'm going to go on to the next video, which talks little bit about their bit more about their tarnished wartime record when it comes to refugees.
After the Second World War, the Swiss felt good about their neutrality, which they thought had saved the country from destruction. They believed their defences had deterred the Nazis from invading. But in the 1990s, uncomfortable revelations surfaced about Swiss banks handling assets looted by the Nazis, and banks refusing to release details of dormant accounts held by Holocaust victims. This prompted the government to set up a commission of experts to investigate Switzerland's wartime past. It was led by historian Jean-François Bergier.
Es war zum Teil eine schmerzliche Sache.
it was quite painful. We had this idealised image of the role of Switzerland during the Second World War, which only really told one side of the story. Due to the Bergier report, new information came to light.
Mit dem Bergier-Bericht sind natürlich auch andere Elemente gekommen.
Bergier's commission found that government and industry had in some cases cooperated with the Nazis, and that Switzerland had turned away thousands of Jewish refugees at its borders. But in the reports on Switzerland's financial activities, what emerges most clearly is a picture of a country confused and under pressure. Markus Somm, historian and editor-in-chief of the Basler Zeitung newspaper, maintains that the Bergier report is one-sided.
Die Bergier-Kommission hat sich nur mit the Bergier Commission only dealt with the darker side, not with the positive aspects. Some of the negative aspects were already common knowledge. The refugee policy was clearly wrong. The National Bank's policy was also incorrect. We knew this, but the banks in general did not mess up, nor did the economy as a whole. The Commission did not make this clear.
Jakob Tanner, co-author of the Bergier report, disagrees. He says it did uncover wrongdoings.
The Bergier report showed that in important areas such as gold transactions, the refugee policy, dormant assets, those in charge did not do all they could to intervene. They simply buckled under pressure from outside.
Eben doch sehr stark nachgegeben haben diesem Druck von außen.
It became clear that neutrality was never entirely respected by the warring parties or by the Swiss themselves. But without it, Switzerland may have been drawn into the war and occupied by the Germans.
Yeah, so as you can tell, it's a very touchy subject about like when you dig a little bit deeper, like the Swiss actions during World War II. While they tried to maintain neutrality as much as possible, often by circumstance, they were forced to comply with sides occasionally. So one of the homework questions is about that, so you guys can research that more if you'd like. Of course, also, I don't know how that slide went out of place. Okay, we're talking about the Swiss Army. So now I'm gonna shift focus from World War II more onto like modern day, what the military is like. It has universal male conscription with optional conscription for females. And it's a all males are required to participate, and this is the Swiss model was actually the basis for which the Israeli model was based off of, and that in turn was the model for Singapore. So a lot of the countries that like do have like this like universal male conscription are actually based off of this Swiss model. And so how the Swiss military works, unlike the Israeli and Singaporean one, is it's still very small. It only has a full-time corps of about 220,000 soldiers, but it can mobilize many more, up to 600,000 within a few days' notice. And it's actually been growing smaller over time due to many reasons. One, many businesses businesses started claiming that like, conscription is like a huge burden on like business. You're basically taking away a lot of like working eligible people and like forcing them into the military. And then also like just the fact that like the first video said, like Switzerland's basically surrounded by EU members at this point, and people really question like, hey, is this completely necessary to like spend this much money on the military? A little bit about how I don't know, I find this part super cool. A lot of like what they do with like fortifications and stuff. The Swiss Army basically mandates that all bridges, hillsides, tunnels be designed that they can be remotely destroyed in order to prevent any entry into the country. Basically, there's like fuses and like dynamite that are designed and built into the bridges. Basically, how the system works is you have civil engineers, like civilian civil engineers, who are designed to architect the construction of the building, and then you have like military officers that are designed to work with that civilian civil engineer to architect the destruction of the building. But the cool thing is, because most of the civilians are military members, that's usually the same person, and so they're given a double duty, one from the civilian side as a construction worker, and then the same person is assigned by the military to figure out how to destroy the same building. And basically, all of the bridges, they're also like lined with artillery around it, so that way, once it's blown up, any attempt to like reconstruct it will be like shot down. Even entire mountainsides are rigged with explosives, basically in order to collapse a valley and like create these landslides so people can't even get through these mountain passes. A lot of the mountains near the German border have been tunneled so extensively that entire divisions could fit inside. Some of the mountains have entire hydroelectric power stations inside of them. And if a company of soldiers had to climb down the mountain, they could climb down the inside of the mountain instead of the outside. So this is like an example of like, aircraft guns that are kind of designed that are like covered looking to look like rocks. This is an entire airplane hangar built into the side of a mountain and like camouflaged. They definitely go very overboard and a bit paranoid. A lot of them are becoming like decommissioned because they realize like, it's maybe not worth the upkeep to keep like running all of them. A lot of them have been turned into museums, and a cool tidbit is a lot of them have been turned into secure data facilities. So because a lot of these are like nuclear resistant like facilities, so a lot of data providers, like how cloud storage works is you still need to have servers somewhere. And so a lot of like very secure data systems are like put in these Swiss mountains, so that way like the data never gets physically attacked. The email provider that I use, Proton Mail, is it's based in one of these kind of facilities in a like nuclear Swiss like missile silo. One thing that always gets overlooked that I think is worth talking about is the Swiss Navy. You might think that's weird because if you notice, it's a landlocked country. But you'll also notice that there's a lot of lakes, especially the two important ones are Lake Geneva, which is like right here, and then Lake Constance, which is right there. And they're pretty important because they make up a lot of the border with like Germany and France. So they actually do have a small navy of about 11 boats, basically on those two lakes. And it's technically just a maritime branch of the Army. It's not actually a navy. They have a little aircraft carrier right there. I don't know. I just find their navy really funny. It's a common like joke in the U.S. military that like admiral of the Swiss Army of the Swiss Navy. It's like a quip to like make fun of someone who thinks that they're like really self-important. Play this video. They're also really worried about like nuclear attacks.
Swiss engineering has a reputation for being precise and reliable, and Switzerland has a reputation for being not paranoid exactly, but at least taking a lot of precautions about their safety. Switzerland is the only country in the world with enough nuclear fallout shelters for the entire population. Even now, it's a legal requirement that any new build house here must have a shelter if it's not close enough to an existing one. And okay, a lot of those shelters are being used mostly for storage these days, probably for cheese, but if the world takes a dark path, Switzerland is ready. And that extends to this, the drinking water. I'm in Zurich, the largest city in Switzerland, and it has an entire backup water supply system. The city has hundreds of drinking fountains, free for public use, of all sorts of designs. And okay, most of them are fed from the same pipes as homes and offices. It's mostly filtered water from nearby Lake Zurich with a bit of spring water and groundwater mixed in. It is, of course, some of the safest drinking water in the world because Switzerland. But in the event of an emergency, let's say the lake was contaminated somehow, or there's a days-long power cut that shuts all the pumps down. Not that that's likely because the electricity supply is just as secure, but if it happens, Zurich is still prepared. There is an entire backup water system fed by nothing more than gravity from a spring on a nearby mountain. It runs through 150 kilometres of pipes to taps in hospitals and fallout shelters and special drinking fountains like this. These can all be adapted so they can fill a lot of buckets in a very short amount of time with nothing more than some hoses and scaffolding. This water isn't being wasted, by the way. I mean, it is, no one's drinking it, but if it wasn't going through these pipes, it would just be joining a river and heading straight to the ocean by a different path. Lots of cities maintain some level of redundant water supply, some backup pipes or emergency tankers in case everything fails. But Zurich, they have two systems, constantly tested, always running together, just in case the world ends.
Yeah. So, yes. The point is, very paranoid. There is this one great documentary from Al Jazeera about guns in Switzerland, and I'll play a short part of it, but not all of it, just because we don't have that much time. But
Les hommes, c'est obligatoire, les filles, c'est volontaire. Je pense que le service obligatoire, comme il est présenté maintenant pour les hommes, est très bien. On a la possibilité de faire un service long ou un service court et avec des cours de répétition. Chacun a le choix. Je trouve ça très très bien. Le château de Colombier dans le canton de Neuchâtel, une grande place d'armes connue pour son service militaire, également pour tout ce qui est école de police. Cet endroit est magnifique, c'est un petit peu un coup de cœur. J'ai engagé ici beaucoup d'heures, beaucoup de journées militaires, puisque je me suis engagée au service militaire. Là, c'est le jour où j'ai reçu mon grade de caporal, avec toute la compagnie qui a reçu le grade en même temps que moi. Et là, c'est quand mon officier m'a dit « Soldat, vous êtes caporal ». L'idée, c'était d'apprendre à servir mon pays et d'enfin, moi aussi, apprendre à quelqu'un d'autre à servir son pays. Je suis quelqu'un de patriote, très sentimental pour mon pays, et comme notre armée n'est qu'une armée de défense, c'était un devoir. Depuis que j'ai été libérée du service, j'ai passé sur un statut de réserviste. Je suis sur une liste et en cas de nécessité, alarme rouge, on va me contacter et puis ça m'importe moins d'être militaire.
Laetitia Giselle is typical of a modern Swiss reservist. During World War II, Switzerland remained neutral. Firearms are still kept in homes because many thought the tiny country could easily and rapidly be invaded. So soldiers needed to be able to fight their way to their assembly point. Historians believe the Swiss avoided German invasion because every man was trained and armed to fight. The citizen army has existed ever since. Military service is mandatory for all men aged between 18 and 34. Soldiers go back to civilian life, but when summoned, they join their units and rejoin the Swiss army. When some conscripts like Laetitia are doing their military service, they are nominated for military rank, receive extra training and get promoted. They keep their rank alongside their civilian work, but without being professional soldiers. They remain available for military service until the age of 50 and beyond, if they are willing and able.
Formazione ho studiato economia e quindi diritto, poi ho fatto una carriera a livello operativo nell'ambito finanziario e industriale.
Les armes conduites suisses, soit 29A
Neutral European country made up of 26 cantons or autonomous regions also ranks among the highest for gun ownership and size of army per head of population in the world.
Approximativement, des chiffres officiels parlent d'environ 2,3 millions d'armes en circulation en Suisse, soit 29 armes pour 100 habitants.
It has compulsory military service, a citizen army of 600,000, and the Swiss routinely keep firearms at home even though there's hardly any threat to their personal safety.
J'ai chez moi 2 armes de guerre que j'utilise pour tirer dans les stands de tir, et puis j'ai une trentaine d'armes de collection. Les armes qu'on n'utilise plus maintenant, qu'on pourrait, mais qui ne sont plus en état de tirer. C'est pour faire beau.
This level of gun ownership puts Switzerland third in the world behind the United States and Yemen, an extraordinary statistic. But compared with the US and Yemen, Switzerland is a relatively peaceful country with very low levels of gun crime. So what is it about the neutral...
Okay, yeah, so that's basically like a really long documentary, like 47 minutes. But it's basically one interesting thing about Switzerland is that it does have it has the 3rd highest gun ownership rate in the world after the US and Yemen, but it actually has very low gun crime rates, one of the lowest in the world. One of the reasons that's often cited for this is that most of the guns that are owned are because everyone has been trained by the military and they know how to use the guns, and then basically it is part of their military duty to keep the guns at home. But so it's the main point is that everyone who is using the gun is trained to respect the gun and how to use it properly. But Switzerland has one of the biggest gun cultures in the world. And with that, these are the 3 questions that are 4 questions, sorry, that are there for homework. The first one is, what afforded the Swiss ability to remain neutral when others weren't able to? Okay, the answer is geography, obviously. Okay, but how does this unfair advantage affect how other countries should think about the lessons of Swiss neutrality? So the Swiss often act somewhat self-righteous, and they basically claim that look at us, we're neutral and we don't get involved in conflict. But how well can that model be adapted to other countries that don't enjoy that same benefits of Swiss geography that Switzerland does? Second question is it fair to claim that the Swiss were actually neutral during World War II? You can look into a lot of the stuff regarding the gold, which we will be getting into a bit more later. You can look into refugee stuff, who Switzerland traded with during World War II. Next is, how does Switzerland manage to maintain a more peaceful gun ownership than the US? And finally, have the Swiss adapted their armed neutrality for the modern world? Great, they can stop a tank invasion from rolling into their country, but is modern warfare really fought with large-scale land invasions, and have they really adapted to this modern forms of warfare? And yeah, for homework, because these questions I think are a little bit more involved than some of the past ones, I'm going to ask for a 2-paragraph response on one of the questions, but there's no chapter of reading from the book this time. It's just 2 really short articles. So yeah, I thought that's fair. Yeah, any questions? Cool. Probably take a picture of both of these because you know how bad I am at sending out emails on time. So I will try to get it out on time, but probably take a picture. So